Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How's life?
Life is great. It's going well. And we had the writer and lovely podcast host, and I mean, she kind of is like a Renaissance woman with all the stuff she's doing, Meghan Daum, on the show. So there was a controversy about her name pronunciation. I like Daum, and she's been very kind of do as you wish with it. So I'm going to say Daum, but you're going to say it the German way.
Yeah, I am going to say it Meghan Daum because I like languages and I like the origin of names. I'm very into names, as we'll hear in the episode. And you know, it was a very interesting conversation we started to have around names, which none of us expected.
Yeah,
and I do think, you know, all these kids and they're changing their name and all that sort of thing. I think it's something that's done lightly and also done very heavily with a lot of thought. But actually, it's a seismic thing to do, to change your name. I think it is. And if you're not careful, you can one day almost look in the mirror and think, who am I? I've lost my name. I look different. I sound different, and I have a different name. Who is the person originally? And so I think it is very relevant to talk about names in the context of gender. I really do. I think it's a huge subject, actually. But the conversation, I see Meghan as a cultural commentator more than anything.
Yeah, she's amazing. And she has two podcasts, the Unspeakable podcast and then A Special Place in Hell with Sarah Hayter. And we ended up spending time talking about this unspeakeasy kind of community that she runs, both online and in person, with these like heterodox retreats for women. And Meghan kind of talks about how she started these. And it's interesting because we just spoke with Freya India not too long ago about how rare it is, especially for the younger generation, to find spaces and places where nobody has technology. And when we talked to Meghan about her retreats, she said precisely this: there are no photos, there's no social media, there's no hashtags. And so, you know, we're out in these, you know, events, and it's just a small group of women really just speaking in full honesty without having to worry about that kind of the being watched kind of phenomenon that happens when we all have our phones and we're snapping photos and hashtags. So it was just really interesting to hear that on the heels of Freya India.
I'd like to go on one of those. I wonder what they're like. It does feel that Meghan is, you know, a woman who speaks about women, for women, of women. And she really is a very interesting voice for, you know, the 21st century woman. And I think, you know, it's not leaning too heavily into feminism. Instead, it's just leaning into womanliness, which I think is a lovely way to be. And I'm not saying she's not a feminist. I have no idea. But it's more about the woman's experience. I think it's a very interesting take she has on life.
Yeah, definitely. And something that we also got into, which was really interesting, was like, she's very interested in generations. Like if you read her writing and you listen to her podcast, she brings up different generations a lot. And we talked about how a lot of the current queer young activists probably view us in the same way that like these kind of anti-civil rights bigots were seen in, you know, the 50s and 60s. So we touch on a lot of things, including how we can, I guess, preserve and reclaim humanity through humor. And we got in a really interesting conversation with her about that. And she's had some, you know, comedians on her show, one of whom is Ariel Isaac Norman, who we're actually having on the show very soon. So we're thrilled about that. But it was really nice to talk to Meghan about the role of humor and how that helps us just be humans.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really good conversation, I think, we had with Meghan.
Yeah. So I'll read her bio and then we'll jump in. Meghan Daum, or Daum, is the creator and host of the Unspeakable podcast and the author of 6 books, most recently The Problem with Everything, My Journey Through the New Culture Wars, which was a New York Times notable book for 2019. Her collection of original essays, The Unspeakable and Other Subjects of Discussion, won the 2015 Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction. A Los Angeles Times opinion columnist from 2005 to 2016, she's written for numerous magazines, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Vogue. Meghan is the recipient of a 2015 Guggenheim Fellowship and a 2016 National Endowment for the Arts grant. She taught graduate writing students at Columbia University and the University of Iowa, and now teaches private workshops in personal essay, memoir, and op-ed. Her latest projects include a new podcast, as I mentioned, A Special Place in Hell, which she co-hosts with Sarah Hayter, and startup venture, The Unspeakeasy, an intellectual community for free-thinking women, which she tells us all about in this episode. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation.
Hi, Stella, and welcome Meghan to the show.
Hi.
It's
great
great
to be
to have
here.
you. Yeah, it's great to have you, Meghan. We've listened to you for a long time, so it's great to have you.
Likewise, this is a sort of explosion of it's collision of the parasocial relationship happening right here.
Yeah, for sure. And, I wanted to ask about something totally unrelated to gender just off the top. As I've been listening to your podcast, I've noticed an evolution happening with your name and the way you pronounce your last name.
Yeah.
What's going on? What?
Good question.
Are you having like an identity change midlife about how you say your name?
Look, yeah, exactly. I have last name dysphoria.
Okay.
Yeah, so I know it's the worst thing. I really wish I had changed my name very early in my career. It's one of my biggest regrets. So yeah, just right. So I grew up. My last name is Daum. I grew up pronouncing it Daum. And that's how my parents pronounced it. But we were constantly correcting people because most people said Daum, and we were always going, no, it's Daum, it's Daum. And then I realized for complicated reasons that nobody else in my family said Daum. They all said Daum, all my relatives. And just for various reasons, my parents had rebelled and changed the pronunciation. So sort of in my 20s and 30s, I just stopped correcting people. And I never had to say my last name very often. I would just avoid saying it. And then when I started doing the podcast in 2020, I, for the first time, had to say my last name over and over again. And I felt weird saying Daum. My father had recently died. I felt very, I felt disloyal by saying Daum. So I started saying Daum. And then everyone was like, what? I thought your name was Daum. I've been mispronouncing your name for 20 years. And then that got all weird. And then stupidly, about a year ago, tried to go back to saying Daum. Anyway, it's just a total mess. And I regret the whole thing. And you can call me whatever you want. I think I'm going to just, right. What do you think it should be? I've been saying Daum. I've been saying Daum, but I don't care. You know what? I wish I were Delilah. I should just have one name like Meghan. I had a radio show in college at the college radio station, and I just said Meghan without saying my name at all, my last name at all, for this very reason. And so here we are.
Wait,
so
can I ask a little bit about that? I'm really interested to know, why did your parents kind of mispronounce it? And also, I had my own weird experience with names, so I get you, because a few things happen with me and names. I take names very seriously. So when kids are talking about names and changing the name, I actually think it's actually very interesting. And Lionel Shriver, who's speaking at our conference in Lisbon, she changed her name from Margaret Ann to Lionel when
Yes.
she was 12.
Yes.
Like, Lionel is a man's name. It's an awful man's name. No offense to Lionels, but it's pretty awful. So I got married. I got married, and I'm called. I'm from O'Malley, and I got married, and I was going to be Thompson, and I thought I was going to be. I really was very romantic about getting married, and I was going to be Stella Thompson, and I was so sure I was going to be Stella Thompson. Kind of like yourself, Megan. I tried it out for quite a while, and it just brought up all sorts of strange.
Really?
Yeah, Thompson, Stella Thompson. I'm not Stella Thompson. What the hell is going on? Am I Stella Thompson? I suppose I am. I'm married. I obviously think too much.
No, this is so profound, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I went back to O'Malley, and it was a pain, because then I had to tell my poor father-in-law, who's very into heritage, that actually, no. I'm not.
Wow, you were like
yeah.
sister. We're like detransitioners of names.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was just thinking that, because sometimes young people or adults who desist or detransition go through a period of time where they say stuff like, I don't care what pronouns you use for me, it's whatever. Or like, I don't care what name you use. And then they eventually kind of move into a little more of a concrete place. So it's interesting to hear you say, Megan, I don't care, just call me whatever you want.
Oh my God,
you're
I
in
never
limbo.
made this connection. Oh my gosh, we spent all this time thinking about gender, and I actually never made this connection. Yeah. Well, my parents, to answer your question. So, I mean, I think it's a German
Yeah.
name, and it comes from Daumen, which means thumb. If you are in Germany, I guess it is Daum.
Uh-huh.
But, my parents were from Southern Illinois. A lot of it had to do with their own striving, and they're distancing themselves from their family. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there that we don't need to go into, but they had met, I guess when they were very first married, they had met some German professor who was like, oh, your name is Daum. That's how that should be pronounced, and they go, okay. But that would suggest that they had been saying Dom all along, which literally didn't occur to me till I was 30 or something. Anyway, whatever. I am going to try to go back to saying Dom, but everybody who knows me from my publishing career says Dom. And then everybody who knows me from the podcast and onward says Daum, because that's what I was saying. But, we're no longer in a kind of writing world. Everything is spoken. So pronunciations of names are much more significant than they used to be.
Well, the linguist in me prefers, I think, Daum. That's the German original.
Okay.
Purist.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
To further about names, I named my little boy. It was a very hard year. My husband had been very sick, and my dad died. It was a very, very extraordinary year. But anyway, I named my little boy Adon, and then we changed it. Yeah, I know, revolutionary. Shocking.
Really?
Yeah, very funny. I shouldn't say very funny. A very interesting episode of my life. Very interesting.
Wait, how old was he when you changed his name?
Well, I remember I was in bed breastfeeding my little fella, and he was a couple of months old, and yet again I was agonizing about the name. And then we changed it. Yeah, well, it actually happens way more often, because when I changed his name, what happened was so many parents came up to me saying, I wish I'd changed my kid's name. I wish I'd changed my kid. So many.
Wow.
And my mother, funnily enough, she called my big brother Ronan. And, whenever his birthday rolls around, he's 50 now, but whenever she'd have a few drinks and names came up, she would say, oh, I always wanted to call him Thomas. She always would say it. Do you follow me? So I grew up with hearing regret, and I changed it. It was the best thing I ever did.
Wow.
That's so fascinating, because also, Stella, you are somebody who talks about regret in this really powerful way. I mean, I remember when you were on The Unspeakable, and we just talked about that, and just how much courage it takes to say, I really regret this thing, because it's actually sort of not nuanced. You regret something, that's it. You regret it.
Courage. It takes courage to
and
say,
to just live
I
in
made
that.
a mistake. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I definitely regret not changing my name before I started publishing or anything. I should have just found an easier name, taken a different family name, something like that.
Well,
Megan
Huge
Smith.
regret. Or not that, but we had much more Anglican names in the family on my mother's side that I could have taken. But I thought that my parents would have been angry. They were really, they had a lot of investment in weird stuff. So,
well, this is actually really interesting because this
Yeah.
exact theme comes up in the subject that we all three are quite obsessed with, which is gender. As kids change their names and kind of cut ties with the name their family gave them, and they're kind of charting their own path, and they're like, I don't feel connected to this name. So anyway, one question that, we talked about before we started recording is like, why gender? There are so many interesting topics right now going on in the culture. Why have we all gotten obsessed with gender? And I guess, Megan, you've given this some thought, perhaps, or maybe you can flesh it out right here, right now, live on the Gender Widerland podcast. But why do you think gender has captivated our attention and also lots of other people's attention, right? Like, this is not a marginal topic anymore. Everyone's kind of talking about it. So what do you think?
I think there are so many avenues into this. I think there are so many reasons that people are obsessed with this or so captivated anyway. I guess fundamentally for me, it's a question about what is reality. I mean, it is the ultimate existential kind of construct, right? It's the ultimate kind of problem to chew on. What is real? How are we using language? How do you go through the world as a human being? Are we disembodied? How connected are we to our bodies? What's the relationship between the conceptual world and the physical world? Like, that to me is really interesting. But on a more just kind of day-to-day basis, I think there's just something incredibly maddening, and it can make you obsessed when you see people behaving in an incredibly unhinged, often destructive, vindictive way about basic facts. Like, you start to question yourself. Like, am I crazy? Am I getting this wrong? Like, you are seeing something playing out before your very eyes that is absolutely counter to everything you know about material reality, but it is then being embraced by institutions and it's all over the culture. I just don't think we've ever seen this kind of, I don't know if mass psychosis is too strong a framing, but I don't know that we've ever seen anything like this, certainly not in my lifetime.
Matthias Desmet, who's a great leading thinker, he's in Belgium, he calls it mass formation, and he gives some really interesting thoughts around this, and it does feel like mass formation is a good explanation of it. It also goes to the very heart of what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, what makes me a woman, what makes me a man. And then as I got into it, and no more than yourself, Meghan and Sasha, then, like you said, silencing of debate, and then suddenly it was like I was unraveling an onion, because then it was the rot at the center of academia, academic fraud. Then suddenly the rot at the center of the media, all these journalists who had taken a job to kind of expose the truth without fear or favor. Oh, turns out none of them were, well, very few of them, honorable exceptions. Then you go further in and you go your own profession, psychotherapy, psychology, psychoanalysis, and then authoritarianism. Suddenly you become an expert on everything when you get interested in gender.
Right. Yeah. And we got into these professions presumably because we were interested in what is true. Right. And so when you see the very opposite interests, manifesting in everybody around you, you're like, wait a second, this is the reverse of why I was interested in this. And then you begin to doubt yourself. Like, was I crazy? Was I totally misreading the room? Yeah. Was I totally naive? Like, what happened? And then, you do really feel like you're crazy. So I feel like so much of this issue is just kind of on an individual level for those of us who are interested, like a process of trying to figure out where we are crazy, if we are crazy, what we're missing. I mean, everyone's doing their own sort of little psychological work within the larger issue, right?
Yeah. I mean, many people that I talk to have this kind of trajectory unfold, particularly parents, particularly people who have been like historically progressive or liberals, with this question of like, I'm seeing something happening all around me. I really can't understand what I might be missing because I don't agree, but these are my people. These individuals or these fields or these industries or whatever have always kind of helped me feel like I'm standing on solid ground. And then all of a sudden, everybody else has this totally weird alternative belief. And you really do start to question yourself. And it's very destabilizing. So I think you're right. We're all doing this kind of psychological work to figure out, like, are we crazy?
Yeah.
And it's kind of scary. And I think that we are kind of in a shifting place around this, I hope. And I'm wondering, because like you run these events, the Unspeakeasies, where like I know you have an online group and then you also run in-person events. I know I spoke at one of them. And
Yes.
talk a little bit about that, and how does gender come up in the context of these kind of like, they're not secret meetings, but they feel kind of like special and exclusive from like what I can gather.
Right. Well, I mean, the model is an old fashioned unspeakeasy, like during Prohibition era, right? So the unspeakeasies were where people got together and drank during Prohibition. So it was an underground. Yeah, it's been a fascinating process putting together this project. So, well, I mean, I can just back up a little bit. I mean, I got the idea for the Unspeakeasy, which is named after my podcast, The Unspeakable, which it was named after a book that I published in 2014 that really didn't have anything to do with the culture wars. Or, I mean, I guess it would have been a culture war-y if it had come out a few years later. But in 2014, that was just called, thinking about stuff in a normal way. Yeah, I taught writing for a long time. I've been a working writer and journalist for almost 30 years, I'm horrified to say. And I've always, had people coming through my classes, and a lot of women would take my workshops and memoir, personal essay, that kind of thing. And I started noticing around 20, right around the time I started doing the podcast, even before then, had women coming to my writing classes who were really not only, or in some cases, not even looking for a space to do their writing, but because they knew that I was going to be kind of providing a safe place to talk about issues in a sort of nuanced way. And they were saying things like, gosh, I was in this other writing group, but I kind of got kicked out because I was writing characters that were not the same identity as I am, or I was in a book club and everything imploded because I didn't want to read Robin DiAngelo or whatever it was. Or, they were just talking about these instances of social exile. And, I had men also in the classes, and this would come up too, but women had a very particular way that they were experiencing these culture war blowups. And it wasn't just the professional ramifications that was definitely happening, but it was really also this kind of destruction of relationships. And they weren't just scared about what was going on, they were heartbroken. I mean, they had lost their best friends over stupid things, often having to do with gender. They had fallen out with parent groups, religious groups, and it was really devastating. And it was just clear that on top of all of that, they weren't speaking out. I mean, at the same time. So, I started my podcast, The Unspeakable, in 2020. I think you guys started that same year, maybe later in that year.
Later that year.
And,
yeah.
There were definitely obviously there are a lot of women doing podcasts and in this independent creator space, but it's still very male dominated. I mean, the free speech world, a lot of men are talking. There's some obvious exceptions, but it was really like, I would go to these listener communities of the podcast and it would be like all these guys, in these Zoom hangouts. And I thought, why aren't the women speaking up? They're silencing themselves. Why aren't they in this conversation? And a lot of it was because they were so afraid of the social exclusion that is so inherent to the way women deal with other women. I mean, this is how women fight. We don't fight with our fists. We fight by excluding other women. And so I thought this is really messed up because these sort of, middle school mean girl dynamics are mapping themselves onto the culture wars and onto the discourse and onto people's intellectual lives. And all of these issues are being dominated by men because women are silencing themselves. And I thought we cannot have this. And we need to have some kind of heterodox community for women. And so I just sort of started brainstorming. And yeah, I went out and I took about 9 women out. We went out to the desert and we spent 3 or 4 days just brainstorming and talking about these different culture war issues in this incredibly fascinating way. It was all off the record. Everybody was sort of from a different walk of life and had different kind of interests. And it was just revelatory for us. And I thought we have to figure out a way to keep doing this. So yes, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, sort of what is the basis for this project? It's just to take women, get us in person in an off the record space, no Instagramming, no social media, no photographs. We're just going to sit here and have candid, honest conversations and try to just find ways to be in the world in an authentic way where we don't feel like we're crazy and we're not silencing ourselves.
Extraordinary. I suppose when you look at the big 5 with personality and agreeableness and disagreeableness, and women are more likely to be agreeable. And if you get hunter-gatherer about it, we need to keep the community if we were to be looked after when we were sick. And we didn't need to be in competition. We needed to get on with people, arguably. And to this day, if you've got babies, your instinct is to find the community so that your babies will integrate. It does feel very ingrained within us. And then, when you think of the arrival of the gun, and what that did to mankind, especially men, with their physical aggression, and then the arrival of social media. I'm not saying it was like the gun for men, but it was a phenomenal impact on women. It has been. I just feel so many of the attacks, they feel incredibly, there's an element of social exclusion. There's an element of it's very, very, very driven around. I would argue and I know men are awful on social media. I'm not saying they aren't, but there's something about the female attacks that go in under the skin so deep, so fast, so well, that it feels like it's very catered for women. And the idea that there's a space for women to kind of say to be disagreeable, to not be community, tribal, you know what I mean? It feels very healthy.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of fundamental question that I have, and on the podcast I do with Sarah Hayter, we talk about this all the time, like this question of whether women are the drivers of cancel culture. I think that's a very ham-fisted, reductive statement. So I don't want to, I want to be careful about that. But there is this, if you've been following these like ideas about the longhouse and all this kind of stuff, the way that the culture has become sort of feminized and sort of female social rules are kind of the framework for a lot of the way we live, in the social media world, and just, in the real world is very much controlled by what happens on social media. And I don't want to overstate that. It's obviously not the case for everybody, but I think it's pretty significant. And it's hard to talk about because basically what you're saying is, bitchy women are taking over, or like we're browbeating the men. I mean, it's very easy to drift into like really just unhelpful, damaging, misogynistic ways of talking about this. But I think it is so important that we acknowledge what is true in order to solve these problems. I mean, that is so much of what's happening, I think, in this podcast space. It's not about just being edgy or saying the dangerous thing or like, the thing nobody else will say. Okay. But ideally the reason that we're saying these things is because we can't begin to solve the problems if we don't acknowledge what is actually happening. And just for some reason in the mainstream media landscape and in academia and in the mainstream, institutions, we're just not allowed to say what's true. And that's crazy making,
Yeah. So what have you found is of particular interest to the women who are part of your community and come to these events? Like, what is it about gender that you think is most salient for them? What have you noticed?
Yeah, a lot of them come in because of gender. Not all by any means. I mean, I wouldn't even say it is one of the many things that we talk about. And there are certainly women in the community who are not interested in gender. Believe it or not, such people exist. But yeah, we do have women that have come in sometimes because they have a child who's gotten caught up in gender identity issues. We have a lot of women who are gay. We have lesbians who are like, wait a second, suddenly my community has changed dramatically. I always thought I was, even if they're of the generation where they were identifying as queer, the contours of that have changed a lot. And our online community, it's really fantastic. I mean, we have almost 500 women right now, and it's it's a private community. It's membership based. We have many different discussion forums. We have guest speakers. We have book clubs. And so there's a lot of women in there who are talking about gender. And, it's really important that they have a private, safe space to talk about what's going on with their kids or what's going on with work or with themselves. And we're just very, very careful about privacy, even though people do, they do need to use their real names. It is not anonymous. So that's important because I need to know who everybody is. But it's also, we're very, very careful about privacy. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing that people are most afraid of in the online community and in the retreats is being identified as some kind of heretic, and they're really worried about their being known in their communities as a TERF. Or we have a lot of therapists actually who are in the exploratory model, but they're really worried about having it be known in their community that they're like the turfy therapist. I mean, it's astonishing because these are enlightened, liberal, compassionate women, and yet they are hiding in the corner.
Yeah. Do you think that, because like something I think a lot about are like personality traits and where that lands people in the context of like, let's say the whole social landscape. And I think these really aggressive and authoritarian belief systems, they have the worst impact on the people who are the most sensitive and reverent towards others. And it's really like, it just exacerbates the differential between people. So if you have someone who tends to be on the bossy, pushy, aggressive side, they're going to take this stuff like a power grab and run. And on the other hand, if you have someone that already tends to be kind of soft-spoken, tries not to step on the toes of others, they're just going to be pummeled by some of this kind of like aggressive stuff. So I don't know if you've been able to glean anything from connecting with these women in your group, but are these women who are already kind of like swimming against the tide, kind of heterodox people? Or do you find that you've created a safe haven for some women who like in their normal life would never be able to speak up?
Both. It really varies. I mean, we definitely have people like us who are sort of less agreeable or just more curious. But yeah, I mean, we hear time and time again, there's women in there who are like, I don't want to hurt anybody. Like I never, like, it's not even just that they're being cowardly or something like that. It's just that it's not worth it. Like, I don't want to die on this hill. Like, I'm not going to say this thing. I don't want to ruin the dinner party. Like, I always say it that way. Like, are you really going to ruin the dinner party over this? And in many cases, they have people very close to them who would really be hurt by this. I mean, a lot of women are in there because their own family members are dealing with this gender thing, and they're torn. I mean, and I also have a lot of people who say, I was totally on board. I mean, I was woke. And I was even canceling people. We have women who've come in, especially younger women, who have said like, look, I was one of the cancelers. I was there not long ago. And then something happens and they say, oh my God. And, one of the amazing things about our retreats is that it's a wide range of women. We have women from their 20s all the way into their 80s. And the retreats are
Wow.
small. They're capped at about, we really never have more than 16 or 17, and they're small groups. And it's just been extraordinary to hear these conversations. And I've had women who were in college not that long ago and part of these activist communities. And
Wow.
then something happens. And so for them to be able to sit with women who are older, and share their experiences and see that there are like so many ways to be in the world. And there are so many ways to be a woman. And I think this goes back to your initial question, Sasha, which is like, why are we so fascinated by this? It's because for my generation, being a girl meant you could be anything, right? There were so many ways to be a girl. It wasn't just about wearing frilly dresses or princess costumes or, being highly sexualized. There were so many ways, and we really fought for that. And it's been remarkable for me to see women in their 20s, for instance, that just have no concept of that. It never occurred to them that you could be a kind of an androgynous woman who's like heterosexual, they just never encountered that kind of aesthetic. And so that's what's been one of the incredibly valuable things about our community.
And could I ask you, do you think, if you were to look at this in the kind of larger picture, are we getting worse right now, or have we reached the nadir? Are we coming back? Where do you think we're at with it?
I don't know. I'm really curious what you guys think. I mean, obviously there are developments in the gender world. We have the Cass report that just came out, the WPATH files. We see this sort of chipping away at it. But again, I mean, we are so much in this world that I think it's easy for us to sort of get too excited about these little developments because they seem huge to us. And David Brooks wrote a very laudatory piece about Hillary Cass and the Cass report. And that's in the New York Times. And that's very exciting. But most people are still going to have no idea what we're talking about. And, the normies, I think, again, all these silos, we talk about this stuff on our podcast. And so we just assume that everybody thinks about it. And the fact is that most people don't. So I don't know. What do you think?
I think the CAF review has made certainly an impact in Ireland and England. I was just at dinner with my family and my mother turned to me and said, "What's this CAS thing? I guess that's good for you." And I said, "Yeah, it's good for me." But there was a general kind of acknowledgement at the table. A few of them knew. It was on the 9 o'clock news. It was, do you know what I mean? That it had
wow.
reached mainstream. Yeah. And that's in Ireland
right.
as opposed to England. So I do think lines in the sand have been drawn that will take some years to come back from, but it does feel like that maybe 2024 will be the year that things started to change when we look back. I wouldn't be stunned, but I think we've years ahead of us. You know what I mean? I think there's a long way to go.
Yeah. It's not going to be on our 6 o'clock news in the US. I can tell you that.
No.
I also think arguably there's a strong case to say that it will stop in Ireland, England, Europe, and it could continue on for decades in America. There's a lot of argument to say that could happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh.
And I think the medical regulation piece almost feels entirely separate from the mindset and mentality amongst trans-identified queer theory youth culture kids. I mean, they're worlds apart. They have no idea that there's a raging medical ethics debate going on in the whole world. They have no clue about that for the most part. And I think there's maybe a certain type of queer theory academic who's also been embroiled in the debates, like a Florence Ashley or somebody who's knows about this stuff, who's a radical trans activist. But young kids who are identifying as trans, they don't really know. So
wow.
I think that the trickling down from medical regulation down to, what doctors can and can't do, maybe that will go into schools and what they can and can't teach. But I think when it finally reaches young people, it's going to be a while before they actually have their beliefs questioned in a way that I guess is impactful to an adolescent. Like, that's my sense, but I could be wrong.
Wow.
I hope I'm wrong.
There's arguably a medical war and a culture war, and they're running in parallel. And the medical war is actually, there's great strides being made. And arguably, you know, we've got the research. Cass has come in. There's systematic reviews. They've been done. The research is only ever going to come back with there isn't enough evidence to support such radical interventions. I don't think we're going to get more research. So it's arguably a bit of a kind of a rabbit hole to continuously look for evidence that we're never going to get, which is evidence not to support it. We'll only ever have, there's not enough evidence to support radical interventions. I don't think we're going to get much further, if you follow me. However, in conjunction, there's a culture war going on, and it's a bigger war. It's in schools, it's in the media, it's among young people, it's within the colleges. And I think it's art, it's social media. I think it's a much, much bigger war. I think it's a much bigger deal. And that's where we need to make ourselves known. And arguably there's too many people our age discussing it very intellectually, and maybe not enough people who are 20 talking about the culture wars. I know they're coming up, and I know they are arriving, but I think it's generational in many ways. But anyway, you were going to jump in and say something.
Yeah, no, that's so I never thought about that, but I guess that makes sense, right? So it's not like people, young activists in the sort of queer trans space are caring what's in the New York Times. So just because David Brooks writes a column about the Cass review, it's not like that's going to be picked up by Pink News or something like that, or there's not going to be Twitter accounts, or we're not going to see on Tumblr some kind of response to this. If there is a response, it's gonna, yeah, right, exactly. Or if there is a response, it's going to be like, look at these bigots on the wrong side of history.
Look at in the
mainstream press, right? Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it must be a profound thing if you are in your 20s, say, or an older or a teenager. You really think that you are on the right side of history. I mean, you would look at these old people like us, and I sometimes feel like they look at us and feel about us the way we feel when we see pictures of during the civil rights movement, where you just see, you know, protesters sitting at lunch counters and absolutely evil looking, bigoted Southern racists with German shepherds going after them. I mean, these images are so ugly, and they're just imprinted on our consciousness with such a profound moral valence. And to think that we are perceived that way by anybody is really disturbing. And I don't know what the solution is, other than I try to just be very respectful and not go too hard and not be didactic. And you guys are really good about that too. But at the same time, it's possible to be too nice about it. And I get pushback for being sort of too much of a respectability politics Puritan, you know.
In what way? What have you kind of gotten flack for?
Oh, I mean, I'm not turfy enough. I'll use people's preferred pronouns out of respect. Yeah, I mean, I get all kinds of pushback. I mean, now what we're seeing, I guess it's a sign of a successful movement, or at least a movement that is maturing, because now we have infighting within it, right? So within the gender critical space, there is fighting, as you know, as you well know, Stella.
For all the attacks, there's great heart to take from it, because it's only when a movement is splintering, is it big enough to be splintering? You know, when people start arguing for their points, it's a real sign that we have got critical mass. You know what I mean? But I wish it could be a little bit more civilized and a little bit more accurate. That's all I ask.
For sure. Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are. We just wanted to take a quick moment and say thank you to all of our listeners. Your support helps us to keep the lights on and the mics hot.
We recently made the switch to Substack so we could build a more robust listener community. Visit widerlenspod.com and check out the different subscription tiers.
For those of you who are in need of parenting support and resources, we each have parent coaching membership groups Plus, you can buy our book, When Kids Say They're Trans.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe and get involved in the lively discourse in the comments section.
Thank you so much. Now, back to the show.
Meghan, I wanted to ask you about something because I was listening to you recently on The Unspeakable, and you were talking to the comedian Ariel. What's her last name? She's amazing.
Oh, Ariel Isaac Norman. Yes.
Yes, she's fantastic. And you guys were talking about something. I think this was her. Maybe it was another author. Anyway, you were talking about how as a writer and as a teacher of writing, you often work with students on how to write their like embarrassing stories. You talked about like slipping on the banana peel.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because it really ties in with something that's often on my mind when I work with desisters. Detransition is a bit different because they have the medical harm piece to contend with, but desisters who never really engaged in any kind of medical intervention often feel mortified and embarrassed about what they've been through. And I kind of tend to say, you need to have a narrative, a cohesive narrative that is self-compassionate about how you got into this. So like the difference between I was an idiot and I was brainwashed by the trans cult versus I was doing what normal people do at this age. I was playing around with aesthetics and identity and stuff, and I got kind of lost.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about the banana peel story, which is like fully letting yourself be embarrassed by something. And I actually thought, oh, that's really good. Like it's such a therapy thing for me to be like, find a compassionate narrative. But there's something about like humor also.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that kind of witty, like head slapping. Like,
yeah,
I can't
you have
believe
to
I
be
did that.
the hero of your own story. Well, the banana peel example comes from Nora Ephron, the late legendary Nora Ephron. So she used to talk about how, you know, you have to be the raconteur. She said, you know, if you slip on a banana peel, you're a fool. If you tell the story of how you slipped on a banana peel, you're the hero. And I just think that is so important. Like you have to own the narrative, and you know, you're allowed to kind of shift it. And I this comes up with personal essays, right? Like this comes up when you write about yourself. It's so important to have a sense of humor about yourself. And you can even embellish, like, you know, like, oh my gosh, I slipped on a banana peel and, you know, everything, the entire restaurant, you know, stared at me, whatever it was. You can have fun with it. And it really then becomes something else. You take something that is, you know, conceivably a traumatic, I'm doing that in scare quotes, experience, and you turn it into a great story that you can dine out on for a long time. I mean, I would like, you know, imagine you go through something, you're a desister, like you have this, you know, embarrassing stuff in your past. Imagine that in 10 years or 5 years, you could be at a dinner party and telling this story and about how silly you were and what was going on in the world and the things that you said and the things that were said to you. And, you know, this period of time in your life, it could be hilarious. You could have people in stitches. Like just imagine this scene. And I think that so much of what is lost in this moment in the culture is sense of humor.
Yeah.
And it's devastating. I mean, what a thing. It is such a strength and it is such a solace to be able to laugh at yourself. And we've been stripped of this. And I'm not sure why, actually.
I'm just thinking why. And I do think, you know, woke Puritanism does lack humor. And I think humor is inherently subversive and humor is transgressive. Generally, humor breaks the rules on some level. If you're telling a joke, there's some sort of expected, and then there's a transgression. Yeah, generally in humor on some level, unless it's slapstick, but that's even transgressive in its way. But yeah, so I wonder, is that why humor is blanked out? Is it to do with subversion?
I wonder, and I might get skewered for saying this, but I wonder if oh good, not just me, Sasha will get skewered too.
Go on, Sasha,
Okay.
go on.
Well, there's a level of it's really hard. I feel really torn even saying this. There's a level of seriousness that is required when you are in a counter movement trying to push back against what is an actual medical scandal, right? So gender criticals, people in our world, let's say, and I don't even use that term anymore, people who are trying to push back against, let's say, queer theory and gender ideology are like dead serious because it's dead serious in nature because medical interventions are really, really serious. But when you are like a protester and you're like an RGB parent, like you have to be really, really serious. But I agree so much that when it comes to like the tools that we give young people who are desisting or detransitioning, there needs to be some possibility for lightness. And I know some people will probably be like, easy for you to say you weren't medically harmed. Fine. I totally acknowledge there's a level of understanding I'll never, ever, ever have. But man, it's just so dismal the way we talk about this sometimes. And I'm sure I've been guilty of it too. But it's like we're also compensating for the frivolous, stupid, like she can get breasts later if she wants to, kind of gender activist. So it's almost like a volleying back and forth, and like each side gets more serious. Like, if you don't do this, it's suicide. So then our side has to get really serious about medical harms, which are legitimate, right? So I don't know. I feel a conflict around like who's to blame. I don't think we can only blame the woke side. I think our side is also can be guilty of this, and I feel really weird saying that.
Yeah, I don't think that whatever gender critical space is known for its great humor either. So yeah, I know we're fighting fire with fire on the humorless front. I mean, there's something to be said for gallows humor, right? Like that's how you get through a really hard, dark situation. I remember Andrew Sullivan talking about this. I think it was on the Fifth Column or something, and he's talked about this elsewhere. So during the AIDS crisis, there was a magazine, like a gay magazine for men. I cannot remember the name of it. I'm trying to look it up here. And it was so dark. Like they would have these spreads where it would be like a sort of Playgirl spread of men who were dying of AIDS, like very seriously ill. And, and it was just making fun of like the sexual posture and everything. And it would be just like, turn on this, turn on that. But it was all like about how terrible, like sick they were, or they have had Kaposi's sarcoma or whatever it was. And it was so brutal. But the way Andrew talks about this, it was so brutal that it was absurd. It was hilarious. I mean, you had to laugh because there was no other way through. There's no option but to laugh at a certain point. And, this was in the 80s, I guess. And that kind of reclaiming of humanity through humor is inconceivable in this moment. You could not do it. And I think that's a real loss. It takes a great deal of cognitive stability, I think, and, having a internal locus of control versus external to be able to metabolize that kind of content. But we just don't see it anywhere. We don't see it in our media. We don't see it in movies. I mean, I remember, remember Team America, World Police?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I used to teach this. So, I'm a little older than you guys, I think, but, speaking of the AIDS crisis, like I remember being in my 20s and it was like still everybody was terrified of AIDS, even, heterosexual people who had only, had one partner ever and lived on a farm in Wisconsin. Like the public health messaging was that everybody is equally at risk. And if you think that you're immune, you're somehow homophobic. Like there was this real political, spin on it. And, I remember that, when Team America World Police came out, they had this whole spoof where they spoofed the musical Rent. And the musical Rent was based on La Boheme, and it was about young people in the East Village in the 90s, and they like all had AIDS. Like every character had AIDS in Rent, and it was taken very seriously. And then World Police, they did this send up, this song called Everyone Has AIDS. And it's just that. Like, my cat has AIDS, my mom has AIDS, AIDS. And it was like the most hilarious thing I've ever seen.
Well,
And I remember showing it to students, and they
yeah.
like basically had a heart attack in
Even though it was many
2017
years past the AIDS crisis. I think it's very important to protect the right to have a sense of humor. You know, when you go back to kind of Tudor times, medieval times, the court jester was able to say the unsayable. He was able to satire, you know, bring about quite, he would really sail very close to the wind. This is when people got beheaded for criticizing the king, and they still had room for humor. So, like, humor has a very long history of saying the unsayable, the the unspeakable. It has existed forever, if you follow me. And the lack of humor, I've often felt with mental health, when you've lost your sense of humor, if anybody's in real anxiety, if you've lost your sense of humor, you really do need help. When you have lost the ability to have any, no, I really mean it. It's a real line in the sand. When you've gone to, I can't smile, I can't even see the funniness in an old Steve Martin film. I just can't see anything funny. That's when you need a bit of help to get you out of it, because you're in a funk. You've gone into the spiral. You know what I mean? Like, something about humor, it's so imperative that we retain it. And I used to think, back when I was young and innocent a couple of years ago, I used to think the comedians would actually bring about the counter-revolution. I thought that, the Dave Chappelle's, whatever, Graham Linehan, that the comedians could, Ricky Gervais, you know what I mean? They were speaking up and they were saying some really extraordinary things. And I thought they will lead it out. They will bring back our culture. And the level of wokeness and purity among comedians, Andrew Doyle, there's a few honorary exemptions, but many of them have I just can't imagine what it's like to go to a comedy club when you're 20 these days. What are they laughing at? It must be awful.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because the comedy clubs, there is still stuff happening in the clubs where they confiscate your phone, or they make you put your phone in the pouch, so, they don't let you film. They don't want to take any chances of anybody filming. If you go to the Comedy Cellar or something like that, you can still hear really edgy stuff. They are working with these issues that they'll talk about gender. They'll hit all these things, but those very same comedians will then turn around and go on the late night shows the next night and just do a completely anodyne set. And that's the problem. Everything is underground. The interesting stuff is underground. The good conversations are underground. The comedy is underground. The thought, the intelligence and authenticity of thought and curiosity are underground. And then you have this emperor's new clothes situation, because everybody wants what's going on underground, but they won't bring it above ground out of some fear. And it just perpetuates itself.
That's what I love so much about what Ariel Norman is doing. I watched, she has like a 40-minute stand-up, and so much of it is gender. And it's so clever and hilarious. And I don't want to give anything away because everyone should go check it out themselves. But that is not underground. And I think people are really hungry for it. And, for people who are willing to, I guess, put themselves out there, for lack of a better term, and just go ahead and do the funny piece on YouTube or on some sort of public platform, it's just so refreshing. And to be surprised by something is the way we get the wheels of our mind turning. And that's what humor does. Like you said, Stella, a good punchline is one that you could not have seen coming from a mile away. And it's amazing. And I actually spoke with a young woman who is desisted, who had never really talked with anyone before about her experience. And it's not visible yet anywhere. We're still in the editing process. But one of the things she talks about is listening to Blocked and Reported for weeks and weeks and weeks, just binge listening. And Blocked and Reported is funny. Like, Katie and Jesse just rip into all kinds of topics in a very irreverent way. And this young woman says, when I first started listening to them, I was shocked that they were joking about those things. And I was kind of offended, but I just couldn't stop listening. Like, they would get me to laugh about something and it just opened my mind. And like, that's the power and they're not professional comedians, right? But just being able to laugh at things that are absurd gives us permission to grapple with the absurdity. But if we have to take something absurd very, very seriously, we're not free to think about it.
Right. Yes. And you will go crazy. If you are forced to take something absurd seriously, that's not a survivable psychological experience, in my view.
I often say to parents who are trying to pull their kids out of the bedroom, out of the internet, consider a comedy club, consider going. Now, it doesn't have to be a subversive comedy club, but any sort of comedy, just let's go for a night out that's funny, a funny film, some comedy, even a film downstairs that's in the sitting room that's comedy. It's something that when you can get people giggling, it softens us, it opens us up to kind of the imperfection of life. It brings out the best in us. And I do think it's a way that if you know your kid and you know what makes them laugh, that's a way to soften the hardest of defenses, if at all possible,
Yeah.
Meghan, I've heard you talk about something that I find fascinating, which is in moments when you have made a joke or have been really funny, you feel like those are your least feminine moments or something along those lines.
Really?
So can you fix up what I just said in your own words? And I want to talk about that because I find this fascinating and I have lots of thoughts about it.
Yeah, I made some people angry with that observation. Yeah, when I was talking to Ariel Isaac Norman on The Unspeakable, we were talking about this idea that women aren't funny. Christopher Hitchens famously had that piece, "Women Aren't Funny." And I that's something I've thought about a lot. Obviously, there are a lot of really funny women. I think that women are discouraged from being funny in some ways. Like, you got to ask yourself, why is it that the class clown is usually a boy? Not always, but often. I think maybe this is changing, but certainly when I was growing up, female vanity was such that I think that women were not able to allow themselves to be funny because there's something fundamentally vulnerable and not, you have to let go of your vanity in order to make a joke because you're making fun of yourself. And I think for women, that's just harder to do. So much of it is wrapped up in being beautiful, desirable, in a very legible way. And so, yeah, I do find that if I'm on stage or something like that, and I make a joke and everybody laughs, it's exhilarating. There's nothing like it. But in that moment, I feel like I've transcended gender. I don't feel like a woman who has made a joke. I feel like a person who's made a joke. Now, that's weird because I usually just feel like a person anyway. Like, as I'm saying this, it's contradicting a lot of stuff I actually do feel. I don't sort of move through the world as a woman. I feel like a person, which I think most of us probably do. But I don't know. I think that there's a reason that men are constantly trying to make women laugh, and it doesn't go the other way. Like, I think Ariel said it perfectly. Like, why is it that the sort of like, nerdy or not super attractive male stand-up comic can get laid after the show, but the female equivalent of him is not going to get laid after the show necessarily? Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to my fiance about this, and his reaction was, well, whenever there's a woman on a stage, she's being evaluated for her hotness, but men aren't evaluated for their hotness. People are just waiting for him to be funny if he's there as a comedian. And I thought it was interesting.
In fairness, the testosterone is visually driven. So there's going to be an element of visuals more so, and with women, it's going to be, there's other aspects that turn it on.
I don't know, because if there's a male comedian who's much more attractive than the average, I think that would actually be a distraction, and everyone would be, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking from myself,
I would never think he was going to be funny. Right.
Noticing his attractiveness and then almost like distrusting his gestalt, because I'm like, if you're supposed to be the funny guy, you shouldn't actually care about your appearance, which is, of course, ridiculous. And I mean, another kind of thing that comes to mind when I think about this is like having had this other life as a dance performer, something I'd notice is that I'm always the class clown in these dance classes. And the belly dance and Middle Eastern dance, it's a very feminine dance. And in practices or whenever, I would always be like making disgusting faces just to make people laugh. And in those moments, it's almost like a mockery of the dance because you can't, I mean, in a way, it's weird. You can't embody femininity while being really, really goofy or gross.
Right.
So, like, I guess I see what you're saying about how, like, you put forward these different things and the femininity recedes to the background. And granted, we could get into the, like, well, what is femininity question? But it's interesting, like, coming from that background of performance where, like, you're trying to make the dance look beautiful and feminine. You can't do that while also being silly and goofy and a little bit, like, raunchy humor kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's really important what you said before. Like if a woman is on stage, she's being evaluated for her looks, at least if she's under a certain age or has a certain type of look. I mean, obviously, if you have like a very butch kind of woman, there's going to be a different kind of dynamic to that. I mean, I wonder too, like you often think about, I often ask myself, well, is it true that like super attractive people are less likely to be funny anyway? I mean, usually you develop, again, this is a total generalization, but often you develop a sense of humor because you're compensating for something else. And I can think of very few like genuinely hot model looking people who are actually funny. I mean, it is very rare. I think it's changing. I have noticed that there are more young female comedians who are conventionally attractive. I think that is changing, and they're genuinely funny. But I have yet to meet a supermodel who is a good stand-up comic. I would challenge anybody to find such a person.
I'd love to see it. So if you are that supermodel comic,
right, male or female,
let us know.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Stella, ask your question now.
So before we move into the exclusive content, is there anything you'd recommend? Any kind of podcast, films, books that you'd recommend that you're watching or reading these days?
Oh gosh. I mean, gosh, we all listen to all of these podcasts. I just read, I have it right here. I just read this novel, Victim, by Andrew Borrega, which is about, have you heard about this?
No.
I don't know if this is
good.
No.
Up. Yeah. This is a novel about a young Puerto Rican guy growing up in the Bronx who figures out that he can get ahead in life if he, checks the identity boxes.
Oh, wow.
And it's great. Yeah, it's fun. It's very funny. It's kind of a comic novel. But it's about, he really takes on this identity DEI stuff in a very pointed way. I mean, it's fiction.
And it's funny.
Yeah, it's funny, and it really. I'm surprised it was published, frankly. So
Excellent.
Yeah, it was Sherman Alexie, when he came on my podcast, recommended it, and I have read it. So I just finished that recently, and
well, thank you. That's a good one. Nothing I love better than a funny novel. We're going to move into our listener exclusive content. And thank you very much for that. That was very interesting conversation.
Thank you. I'm such a fan of you guys, so it's a great honor.
Yeah. Other than, I mean, of course, we'll include your Unspeakable podcast, your Unspeak Easy online community, and your writing, your Substack. Is there anywhere else that, of course, you've written lots of books and essay collections. And by the way, your essay collections have been a huge kind of thing for me. I read your essay collection about writers who decide not to have children, and it was really powerful for me because I think I'm in this boat at this stage of my life. So anyway, I just want to say, like, aside from your current like heterodox stuff, your writing is amazing and I love it. So anywhere else that we should
I also
people?
I do a podcast called The Special Place in Hell with Sarah Hayter, and we talk about culture and politics through the lens of our significant age gap. She's more than 20 years younger than I am, and we have very different lives. But she's super smart and has very sharp and surprising opinions. And so you can catch us every week on A Special Place in Hell. And yeah, too much. There's too much of me out there.
No, just the right amount. Okay, Meghan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.